The spirits of the beleaguered Marines, jammed against the sea walls and taking continual casualties from mortar, machine gun and sniper fire, were lifted by the arrival of the 7 survivors of the Sherman tanks which Melvin Swango had helped guide ashore on Red Beach 3rd. After weaving their way between the wrecked Amtraks, yawning shell craters and strewn bodies, the 4 tanks of 3rd Platoon reported to Jim Crow for instructions. The 3 from 2nd Platoon were placed at Shoup's disposal on Red 2nd. Crow directed his tanks to the southeast in support of the infantry in that part of the tiny perimeter. One Sherman, getting too far ahead of the ground troops, was knocked out by a Navy dive bomber. Another lumbered into an enemy fuel dump and had to be abandoned when it caught fire, and a 3rd fell victim to Japanese artillery. The last of the 4, Colorado, also caught fire, but her crew saved her by driving into the sea to extinguish the flames. Scorched but still operational, she was diverted to the western flank of Red 3rd, and though repeatedly hit, she remained in action against the enemy pillboxes and bunkers. The commander of the tank battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Swenseski, became a casualty very early in the battle. Approaching the beaches, his Amtrak received a direct hit and he was blown overboard and severely wounded. In danger of drowning, although the water was only a few inches deep, he spotted a pile of bodies that had become entangled on a protruding ledge of the reef. Swenseski laboriously crawled over to them and, after making sure that they were dead, climbed to the top of the pile and flopped down in total exhaustion. He remained clinging to his gruesome island all of the first day and all night before he was found. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hawkins' scout snipers had finally managed to link up to coordinate their movements for the afternoon of day. In the words of the report of 15th December 1944, Gunnery Sergeant Hooper and his 2 sections cleared the ship at 4 o'clock and proceeded to the line of departure. They then went to the edge of the reef where the beachmaster ordered them to circle. The boat circled for several hours until Lieutenant Hawkins was contacted. All the scout snipers were loaded into one boat, and the decision was made to go in as far as possible and swim the rest of the way if necessary. They proceeded towards the pier and commandeered 3 usable amphibious tractors. Lieutenant Hawkins then took command of the 2nd and 3rd sections, less Sergeant Morgan and his team, and landed on the pier midway to the beach and proceeded inland. This was approximately 16 past 15. Gunnery Sergeant Hooper, with 1st Section and Headquarters team, made their way to the beach with orders to report to the regimental command post and await arrival of platoon leader. The beach was gained by this group at 14:30. In the meanwhile, Sergeant Morgan and his team boarded the 3rd tractor and landed at the jetty on the boundary of Red Beach 1st and 2nd at 16 o'clock. Because of the situation, the 1st Section men were needed to advance the line to the south side of the airfield, and the 1st Section participated in this advance, where they remained until almost dark. A runner brought a message ordering them back to the regimental command post, that is Colonel Shoup's command post just south of Red 2nd. Lieutenant Hawkins and his 2 sections, less Sergeant Morgan and his team, proceeded to the regimental command post. Because of the time element and strong enemy machine gun fire, Lieutenant Hawkins was told to remain at the command post and set up a defense for the night. Platoon assembled at the command post about 17 o'clock, set up defense, and immediately started to work on Japanese in the bomb shelter near the command post. At the western end of Red Beach 1st, Major Mike Ryan of 3rd Second found himself in charge of a motley force from several units. He had the remains of I, K, and L rifle companies, and 1 machine gun platoon from M of his own battalion, from 2nd, who were supposed to have landed on Red 2nd. He had the survivors of 2 rifle companies and 2 machine gun platoons. Around 100 men from Major Kyle's 1st Second had joined him, and an assortment of dismounted tank crews and Amtrak drivers, heavy weapons men who had lost their equipment, engineers, medical corpsmen and signallers filled out his ad hoc battle group. Over on the eastern side of the cove, the hard knot of Japanese defence positions, which had decimated the Amtraks and Higgins boats at 9 a.m., were still intact. Indeed, this position was one of the last on Betio to fall. Ryan decided that his best chances lay in making an attack southwards from the point along Green Beach, heading down the western end of the island. Later in the day, as our attacks continued on enemy positions, 2 Japanese came running across open space by the airfield, he recalls, with our troops on the left firing on them. How they made it I will never know, but they did get to the area of what later was discovered to be the Japanese command post. Our front was waving forward with the open flank behind it on the left. Seeing the two Japanese moving to our left, we made a search and found a few Marines ashore there, and others on the beach, most of them from other battalions. With these additions, a makeshift line was established behind the left flank of our forward units. During this process, a staff non-commissioned officer came to me dragging his wounded hip, saluted and asked what he could do. Told of the plan, he set out to place the men along the line in the experienced fashion of the competent non-commissioned officer. Through the years I have treasured that salute. He was not from one of our units, and I have no idea who he was or if he lived through the operation. He could not be found after the line was established. Concerned about a possible suicide attack when the day was ended, I ordered the units to withdraw the forward elements to form a continuous line around the point. Few of us slept that night, but there was no attack, and the night passed uneventfully. Bob Libby of 3rd Second recalls, "I was one of the remnants that Major Ryan gathered up to carry out the charge down Green Beach. We did relinquish our gains to fall back for the night. On that night, we on Red Beach first set up a defensive perimeter no more than 100 yards in depth. We knew the sods were all around us throughout the night, but by dawn's early light they had all scooted back to their bunkers. On Red Beach 3rd, Major Jim Crow's enclave was ringed by fires and explosions. The United States warships were still blasting the eastern end of the island, and dive bombers and fighters from the carriers were constantly pounding and strafing anything that moved around the Marines' perimeter. The survivors of Major Rood's 3rd 8th had staggered ashore and were regrouping into some semblance of a fighting force after the massacre on the reef. Crow's Marines were making small incursions into the Japanese lines, as Private First Class Joe Jordan recalls. The beach consisted of about 10 or 20 feet of dry sand and ended on the landward side in a seawall of coconut logs. This was excellent cover for rifle and machine gun fire, but the Japanese began dropping in mortar rounds, a very uncomfortable situation. If you lay there, the mortars would get you, and if you went over the seawall, there was complete exposure to small arms fire. It was too far to swim back to the States, or I may have tried that. Several feet down the beach from us was an Amtrak that had gotten onto the wall and had been stopped. It was at an angle to the beach and gave cover for some of us to crawl after getting on top of the wall. A few feet inland was a deep ditch for an anti-tank trap, and we got into it. There was plenty of cover from the small arms fire, but you had to expose part of yourself to attempt to return fire. The Japanese positions were laid out so that at least one position could shoot into another position. This meant that if we attacked one, then we would be under fire from it, and at least one more. We finally got enough firepower into the ditch to shoot into the firing ports of several of the machine gun nests at the same time. If you could stop their shooting for only a few seconds, it would allow someone to get forward with hand grenades. By now, the flamethrower teams were getting into action and were very effective, if they could get close enough. Flamethrowers are only effective for about 10 or 20 yards at most. A lot of them were annihilated that morning. It is recorded that the Marines had only received their flamethrowers and 2.36-inch bazookas just before leaving New Zealand. The only training they were able to carry out was firing off the sterns of the troopships, which permitted no practice of fire and movement as teams. This greatly reduced their effectiveness and increased their vulnerability when they first went into action on Betio. Tanks which should have landed early were blown up during the time they were attempting to get in from the reef. Their trip required men to guide the tanks around the craters caused by the naval bombardment. Those guys should have gotten a congressional. The tank and the guide were under constant fire from machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Due to the foul-up in not knowing about the reefs, landing schedules were mangled, and a group of Seabees, Navy construction battalions, that is men from 3rd 18th, and their bulldozers arrived early. Those brave bulldozer operators thought they were driving tanks and would pick up the blades and charge pillboxes, using the blades as armor. When they got real close to the firing ports, they would drop their blades and cover the ports with sand and coral. More than one pillbox was silenced this way, and sad to say, more than one operator was annihilated. By afternoon, we had moved inland somewhere close to 100 yards. We discovered that our flanking companies had not been as successful, and the Japanese could sneak behind us and reoccupy positions that we had silenced. Orders were to move back and consolidate the line. Sure enough, we ran into problems with reoccupied positions and had to fight our way back. Just before dark, we were ordered to straighten the line as much as possible and dig in for the night. All hands were low on ammunition and nobody had any water left. Working parties were called for to go to the beach and find both. My sergeant volunteered me. Trip number 1. I managed to haul about a dozen bandoliers of rifle ammunition. Trip 2, a 5-gallon can of water. And Trip 3, several boxes of ammunition for the light machine guns. Some rations were brought in and we had a cold supper of sea rations. Everyone was starved and gulped the food down. Joe Jordan's comment that by afternoon we had moved inland somewhere close to 100 yards. We discovered that our flanking companies had not been as successful speaks volumes about the nature of the fighting on Betio. Every painful yard had to be paid for. The defense always has the advantage in infantry fighting, and here the attackers were advancing over the surface against defenders who were, in effect, lying in ambush underground. The Japanese naval infantry often only revealed themselves in the act of shooting down their attackers from the gun slits of their closely woven pattern of dugouts. It was sometime during the afternoon that everybody became aware of a sickly smell that pervaded the air. The tropical midsummer sun had been beating down all day. Betio lay only 80 miles north of the equator, and the hundreds of dead men who were floating in the lagoon and lying on the beaches were already beginning to stink. The combined beachhead formed by parts of Red 2nd and Red 3rd now stretched from a short distance east of the cove at the west to the edge of the Burns-Philp wharf in the east, with the long pier somewhere near the centre. Major Rood was now ordered to land the remains of his mauled battalion, and they came ashore via the west side of the pier. Amtraks were still in short supply, and the men of 3rd 8th used any form of transport that was available, a few Amtraks and a lot of Higgins boats. Once round the end of the pier, many had to leave their boats and wade the rest of the way. Colonel Carlson, on his way to return to the United States ship Maryland with a situation report for Major General Smith, delayed his journey and used the few Amtraks that were available to pick up as many of these men as he could. The enemy fire was still intense, and many Marines fell and died within yards of the shore that they had tried so hard to reach. Major Rood led some of his men in, leaving his executive officer at the end of the pier to organize the flow of craft arriving from the point of departure. This long central pier had become the main point of entry for all supplies. Unfortunately, a great deal arrived in anything but the order in which it was needed. The expenditure of ammunition was enormous. Medical supplies were in constant demand, and in the searing equatorial heat drinking water was at a desperate premium throughout the battle, and all of it had to be funneled down the pier. But the transports and cargo ships were unloading their supplies as fast as they could get them ashore, regardless of priorities. Constantly aware of the possibility of a Japanese air attack, the captains were anxious to be rid of their loads and rejoin the protection of the United States Navy Armada lying offshore. Colonel Shoup watched in fury as Amtraks struggled ashore with unwanted cargoes while his parched Marines fought for their lives, scrabbling in their emptying ammo pouches or crawling under fire to snatch bandoliers from dead comrades. Once Rood had his 3rd 8th ashore, Shoup ordered him to reorganize his I and L companies to take up a defensive position in the triangle formed by the taxiways of the airfield. The battalion had suffered so many casualties already that they were absorbed into a composite unit with Crow's 2nd 8th Marines. All along Red 1st and Red 2nd, small incursions were made into the Japanese positions, but at great cost. The landing craft in which Private First Class David Spencer of Company E, 2nd Marines had been heading for Red 2nd that morning, had come under withering fire from the Japanese emplacements directly ahead, which forced them to veer off to their right. They ended up near the edge of Red 1st, and Spencer's platoon leader was annihilated in the water as they rushed to get ashore and over to the seawall. I went in around 9:30 a.m. and hit the beach. The guy on the left-hand side got hit very badly in the water, and I went on the right side and made it to the beach and the seawall. There were only 4 or 5 of us from the 2nd Marines in that area. Our job was to get across to the airstrip. About 4 or 5 did make it that far, but were ordered to come back to the beach. They were probably in too isolated a position to be left alone. It was a very rough time out there. Snipers were after me. There was a Japanese next to me in another shell hole. We both took a shot at each other and we both missed. I threw a grenade and finished him off there. We started running across as snipers, tried getting me. I laid like I was dead. I think some other Marine got the Japanese. Private Spencer had a friend called Jack Wren. They had known each other since they were about 12 years old. They went to school together and they joined the Marines together. By one of those odd quirks of fate that sometimes occur during wartime, both David and Jack were on Betio, but in different parts of the beachhead. Jack was with the 3rd Second, assigned to Red Beach first. His landing craft, vehicle, personnel had grounded on the reefs off the northwest end of the island, and he had to wade in towards the murderous fire from the east side of the cove. Seeing that there were survivors over to the west of him, he struggled on between the burning Amtracs and floating corpses until he came across 2 Marines lying on a sandbar about 50 yards offshore, and flopped down between them to rest. "Pretty rough, isn't it?" he said to the man on his left, but immediately realized that he was dead. He turned to the Marine on his right and said, "Look, that guy is dead," only to see that he was talking to another corpse. Jack Wren went on to fight on the western end of Betio under Major Ryan, whom he considered to be a great man and a great officer. He survived the battle and was shipped to Camp Tarawa in Hawaii with the rest of the 2nd Division. Neither Jack nor David Spencer knew at that time that the other had survived the battle. When Jack got a letter telling him that David was alive, he went running through the camp, yelling, "Where is Spencer? Where is Spencer?" Correspondent Robert Sherrod was ashore at the landward end of the pier. After a hair-raising wade ashore from 700 yards out, during which he had faced the full fury of the Japanese fire, he could count himself a seasoned Marine. "I do not know when it was that I realized I was not frightened any longer. I suppose it was when I looked around and saw the Amtrak scooting back for more Marines. Perhaps it was when I noticed that bullets were hitting 6 inches to the left or 6 inches to the right." During his trip ashore, he had been surprised to see an almost naked figure appear from under the water and climb into an OMES, abandoned tank. Sherrod reported the incident to a Marine officer ashore, but he was obviously too preoccupied to do anything about it. These Japanese infiltrators were to give the Marines quite a lot of trouble later. Sherrod found himself a safe spot behind a disabled Amtrak near the seawall. I felt quite luxurious. Not 15 minutes later, in the same spot, I saw the most gruesome sight I had seen in this war. Another young Marine walked briskly along the beach. He grinned at a pal who was sitting next to me. There was a shot. The Marine spun all the way round and fell to the ground dead. From where he lay a few feet away, he looked at us. Because he had been shot squarely through the temple, his eyes bulged out wide, as if in horrific surprise at what had happened to him. Sherrod stayed for quite a time around Jim Crow's command post, watching the wounded coming back in from the small outposts beyond the sea wall, and then decided to try to make it across to Red First, where he was supposed to have landed. Dodging around the wrecks of the Amtraks, he moved along the pier for as far as he could, before making a final dash to a shell hole near Walter Jordan's second command post. Along with another correspondent, he dug a foxhole, and that was as far as he got that day. He estimated that the Marines held 20 feet along, perhaps 1/16 of 1/2 of one side of the island, plus a few men in shell holes on either side of the airstrip. The Japanese held all of the rest of Betio. During the whole day, the Navy had continued their shelling of the island. The battleships Maryland, Tennessee, and Colorado directed their salvos away from the landing beaches, their huge 16-inch guns lobbing tons of steel and explosive onto the Japanese emplacements around the airfield and on the eastern tail of Betio. The cruisers Portland, Indianapolis, Mobile, Birmingham, and Santa Fe poured a saturating fire into the network of coastal defenses, while further out to sea the carriers Essex, Independence, and Bunker Hill flew off and landed on a continual relay of dive bombers and fighters to blast anything that moved in the Japanese lines. The light carrier Independence was providing anti-submarine patrols on the outer limits of Task Group 50 Pains, 3, when at around 6 p.m., news came in from the Control Information Center that unidentified aircraft were approaching at very low altitude from the west. This had all the hallmarks of a Japanese torpedo attack, flying low to avoid radar, and attacking from the west late in the day when the low evening sun would be shining into the eyes of the ship's gunners. Within minutes 15, Mitsubishi G4M Betty twin-engine bombers were spotted on the starboard side. They singled out the Independence and assembled into line formation. Captain Johnson swung his ship 20 degrees port to present the carrier's stern to the incoming planes, but 3 of the bombers swung out of formation to attack from the beam. Johnson now began a series of violent, evasive maneuvers, turning first to starboard, then rapidly back to port. This not only upset the Japanese pilots' attempts to set up their attack run, but brought them within range of the escort destroyer United States ship Hale, which shot one of them down. The remaining Bettys then headed in line for the Independence, pressing on at wave-top height through a wall of cannon and gunfire from every available turret and weapons tub. Within 60 seconds, 6 of the bombers ploughed into the sea, 3 of them crashing within 100 yards of the carrier. 5 torpedo wakes were seen burrowing through the waves. 4 narrowly missed the starboard side of the twisting carrier, passing through her wake, but the 5th exploded against her stern. The Independence rapidly took on water and listed 12 degrees, but counter-flooding, and moving the aircraft to the port side, reduced the angle to 3 degrees. The damage was not as severe as it might have been. A 40mm gun was blown overboard, as was a fighter which was parked on the flight deck immediately above the point of impact, but the torpedo had exploded within 30 feet of a rack containing 7 torpedoes for the carrier's Avengers, without detonating them. The Independence was detached from the task force and made her way back to the United States of America and the West Coast Navy yards without further incident. David Shoup had decided to use the 3 surviving Sherman tanks of 2nd Platoon, which had become available to him on Red Beach 2nd sometime around noon, in an attempt to link up with the Marines that he knew were ashore somewhere on Red 1st. The Japanese strongpoint on the eastern side of the cove was a major headache to Lieutenant Colonel Jordan in his attempts to move his 2nd westwards. Here the Japanese are thought to have had 2 37mm and 2 70mm or 75mm guns, plus a number of 13mm machine guns, all firmly entrenched in log and coral emplacements on which nothing had so far made any impression. Neither did the Shermans have much success, and after slogging it out for about an hour, they swung inland towards the airfield taxiways to help scattered groups of Marines who had been fighting a desperate point-blank battle of attrition with the Japanese all morning. One tank slithered into a large shell hole, probably from a battleship's 16-inch gun, and could not climb out. A second was knocked out by a Japanese infantryman with a magnetic mine and had to be abandoned. The lone survivor continued fighting, shelling enemy emplacements and charging groups of Japanese in their foxholes. The Marines holding this precarious triangle around the east and west taxiways were remnants of Major Kyle's 1st 2nd and Lieutenant Colonel Jordan's 2nd Marines, both of which had been badly mauled that morning landing on Red 2nd. Their advance of a few dozen yards from the beach had taken hours of furious close-quarter fighting that left them near exhaustion. Almost all these Marines were fighting in makeshift groups from different companies, even different battalions. But in true United States Marine Corps fashion, they had quickly and efficiently blended into cohesive fighting units. Robert Sherrod recalled seeing one of the Marines from this group who had come to collect some cigarettes for machine gun crews across the airfield. Private First Class Adrian Strange stands for a few minutes, fully exposed to the sniper who had been pecking at us. Then the sniper opens up again, the bullets rattling against the coconut logs. Private First Class Strange sings out, "Shoot me down." Then he leisurely turns around and walks back across the airfield, carrying his carbine and pack of cigarettes. The artillery, which had remained offshore all day, was finally directed to come in to Red Beach 2nd late in the afternoon. As most of the 75mm pack howitzers were shipped aboard landing crafts, personnel which were unable to cross the reef, it was imperative that sufficient Amtracs be rounded up. 2 batteries, A and B of 1st 10th Marines, were transferred to Amtracs at around dusk and ordered to land on Red 2nd. Due to a misunderstanding, C Battery was also sent in, although they had not yet been able to find any Amtracs in which to transfer their equipment. This battery had to land at the end of the pier, and the Marine gunners were forced to manhandle their heavy pieces along the pier and through waist-deep water to the shore. By nightfall, 5 batteries of artillery were ashore and ready for what the next day would bring, and so the first day of the battle for Tarawa drew towards an end. The furnace temperatures cooled and gave way to a slight breeze. To the relief of the Marines crouching in their precarious rifle pits, it was even more of a blessing to the wounded, lying in their dozens on the narrow coral strip that passed as a beach. The American foothold on Betio was tenuous. About 5,000 men had left the point of departure that day. Many were dead or wounded, and the unknown number who remained fit to fight, something over 3,000, held no continuous lines, just a series of loosely connected foxholes, captured trenches and dugouts. On the right of Red Beach First, Major Ryan and his assorted band held a piece of the northwest tip of the island, about 250 yards wide and 300 yards long, with the sea on two sides. Their supply situation was critical, and they had no means of evacuation. On the combined Red 2nd and Red 3rd beachhead, the troops on the western flank of Red 3rd and the eastern flank of Red 2nd were in sporadic contact, but there was a 600-yard gap between them and Major Ryan. To the west, their front line ended about 300 yards away from the pier, and to the east at the Burns-Philp Wharf. Inland, the lines stretched about halfway to the main runway of the airfield at the deepest incursion. Colonel Shoup had no illusions. He knew that a major Japanese counterattack could be expected. Night attacks were a Japanese specialty. Could the Marines hold? Darkness came swiftly, as it does in the Pacific, and an uneasy silence descended, punctured only by the gunfire of a destroyer out in the lagoon. The Marines kept silent, their training standing them in good stead. Nobody was going to reveal their position to an enemy who in some places was crouching only yards away. The breeze wafted the smell of decomposition all around the island. Even 1,000 yards offshore, where the 600 men of Major Lawrence Hayes' 1st 8th Marines had been waiting in their landing craft at the line of departure since mid-morning, the stench of death was detectable as they tried to settle down for another 10 hours in their cramped, bobbing boats. At 7:11 p.m., Major General Smith had signaled to Colonel Shoup, "Hold what you have, develop contact between landing teams, clear hostile machine guns still holding out on beaches, make provision to meet organized counterattack." For Joe Jordan of Major Crow's 2nd 8th Marines, squatting in a foxhole on the outer limits of Red 3rd, there would be little sleep during the night of November 20th, 21st. Orders were for one man in each hole to stay awake. There was also a good chance that the Japanese would pull a banzai and attempt to drive us back into the lagoon. Would not have been too hard to do, as we were all exhausted and had lost about half of our forces. I do not know the name of the ship, but in just a few minutes we heard the sound of a destroyer coming our way. It was the United States ship Ringgold, still living up to her name, that of a famous officer of United States Horse Artillery in the Mexican War. I thought that they ran aground to establish a firing platform, but have never heard anything to verify this. Anyway, those gunners sat there all night and pounded any target that we called for and saved our rear ends. Several times we could hear the Japanese troops beginning the banzai chant and would call for fire towards that location. To this day, I believe that we would have been overrun that night if not for that naval gunfire. There was very little sleep and almost no rest that night. Sometime during the night, Japanese bombers from the Marshall Islands to the north arrived over Betio and attempted to bomb the shipping lying to the west of the island. Met by heavy anti-aircraft fire, they jettisoned their bombs and left. There was also sporadic machine gun and sniper fire from the Japanese lines, which did not bother the Marines until they realized that some of the fire was actually coming from their rear. It became apparent that numbers of Japanese had swum out into the lagoon and onto the abandoned Amtraks, tanks, and other assorted craft that lay scattered off the beaches, and were firing at the Marines with the machine guns mounted on these. Before dawn, one of the big Kawanishi flying boats arrived to investigate. It circled around for a while, dropped a few small bombs into the lagoon and flew away. The 2nd Division Marines, who were veterans of Guadalcanal, remembered these flying boats by the nickname Washing Machine Charlie, from their peculiar throbbing engine noise. In Major Mike Ryan's perimeter on the western point of Red First, Bob Libby and 4 other Marines were looking for a secure place to settle for the night. We came across a flight of concrete steps leading to an underground bunker. Cautiously, we ventured down the stairway and found the place empty. Here, we decided, was where we would set up for the night. We worked out a guard roster that would give us 1.5 hours each. When my turn came for the watch, I made my way up the stairway and took up a position where good vision could be maintained over the clear space around the bunker. I knew there were Japanese around us. The sound of slithering bodies in the sand and the rustle of palm fronds attested to this fact. A voice in English would call out for a Joe, Jack or John, or for a medical corpsman. These had to be Japanese, as no Marine would ever give away his position after dark by talking. The discipline of our fellows was spot on, letting the Japanese know that they were up against well-trained troops. Not a shot was fired throughout the night, but still the Japanese did their best to upset this discipline. Sitting snug in our little bunker, we had quite a peaceful night, as I recall. The Japanese failure to mount a counterattack on the night of 21st November was their greatest mistake and cost them the battle. The great majority of the garrison were still alive. They had large amounts of ammunition and supplies available to them, and they were the masters of the nighttime banzai attack. The Americans, on the other hand, were hanging on by their fingertips. Small, dispersed pockets of Marines, few of them in contact with each other, were scattered around the northern part of the airfield in the center of the island, dug in where night had found them, with no coherent defensive perimeter and lacking many of their heavy weapons. The majority of those ashore were still huddled behind the sea wall, many of them wounded, most of them short of ammunition, food and water. The number of serviceable tanks could be counted on one hand, although frantic effort during the night to recover flooded Shermans off the beach would get 2 more back into action on D+1. Only a small proportion of the artillery were ashore, and the pier was jammed with unwanted supplies of all descriptions. Over on Red Beach first, Ryan and his men were squeezed into a tiny pocket on the northwest tip of the island, with the sea on both flanks, almost out of ammunition, and with many wounded. Shoup, Crow, Walter Jordan and Ryan were all certain that there would be a counterattack. Years of Marine training left them in no doubt as to their predicament. The only questions in their minds were how long could they hold on, and where did they go if they could not. On the United States ship Maryland, Julian Smith passed one of the worst nights of his life. He declared at the time that this was the crisis of the battle. A general counterattack would almost certainly have driven the Marines back into the sea, where any evacuation could only have been achieved with appalling losses, if at all. How could the Japanese have missed such an opportunity? The historians have pondered the question for 50 years without coming to a completely satisfactory conclusion, but the death of Admiral Shibasaki has always been shrouded in mystery. The accepted theory has been that he died on the 3rd day of the battle when the fighting around his command post, a little way inland from the Burns-Philp Wharf, was at its fiercest. However, more recent research by the distinguished marine historian Colonel Joseph Alexander suggests that the admiral and his entire staff may have been annihilated on the afternoon of the first day of the battle, when a shell from either the Ringgold or the Dashiell exploded outside his headquarters, while the command staff were moving to an alternative site somewhere on the south side of Betio. If this is correct, and Colonel Alexander's arguments are persuasive, then the Japanese failure to mount an organized, coordinated attack on the beachheads becomes more understandable. Over the years, it has been suggested that the massive naval bombardment of the first day, though not fulfilling its original purpose of annihilating the Japanese defenses, did chew up their communications system so badly that Shibasaki was unable to organize a counterattack. This theory has always been suspect, even if there were not a single working field telephone left in the Japanese positions. The distances involved were small, fighting had largely subsided for the night, and under cover of darkness, over ground they knew well, there is no reason why runners could not have got through with the relevant orders. But if Shibasaki and his entire staff were dead, then such orders were never given. It was believed at the time that Japanese troops, once deprived of their leadership, were apt to become disillusioned and disorganized, as was proven on the neighboring island of Apamama, where the entire garrison committed suicide after their commanding officer accidentally shot himself. If only junior officers of the dispersed companies of the Special Naval Landing Forces were left to organize the defense of Betio, it is easier to see why resistance began to fragment so rapidly from the second day onwards. Major Hayes's 1st 8th Marines were still embarked in their Higgins boats at the line of departure, and the 6th Marines combat team were on their transport ships awaiting instructions. At 2 a.m., Julian Smith sent a message to Colonel Elmer Hall, commanding officer of the 8th Marines, and thus of Combat Team 8th, asking the location and condition of his 1st Battalion. Hall replied that they were resting easy at the point of departure near the United States ship Pursuit. This must have been an optimistic description of the status of men who had been cramped in their uncomfortable, unstable landing craft since mid-morning the previous day, bounding about in a medium swell, choked with diesel fumes, and without food, drink, or toilet facilities. The part played by the Assistant Divisional Commander, Brigadier General Leo Hermley, in the landing of Hayes' battalion on the second day of the battle is a matter of controversy. It will be remembered that because of the breakdown in the ship-to-shore radio communications on day, Julian Smith had decided to send Hermley ashore on the afternoon of the 20th to assess the situation and to get a report back to him. At around 5:30 p.m. on that first afternoon, Smith had received a faint radio message that Hermley was at the end of the pier and was under heavy enemy fire. Within 10 minutes, Smith ordered Hermley to proceed to the shore and take over command from Colonel Shoup, but once again the communications system failed. Hermley never received the divisional commander's order. More significantly, Smith was unaware that Hermley had not got his message and confidently assumed that his deputy was ashore and in command on Betio. Only with the arrival of Evans Carlson on the Maryland at about midnight after a difficult trip via the Pursuit and the Zealand did Julian Smith learn that Hermley had never arrived. Believing him still at sea, Smith radioed the Monrovia to order Hermley to move his divisional forward command post ashore, but by then events, and the repeated radio failures, had outpaced the order. Having had no further word from the Maryland, Hermley spent the night of 21st November at the seaward end of the pier, organizing the evacuation of the large numbers of casualties who were constantly arriving from the beaches, and directing the delivery and forwarding of ammunition and other supplies as they arrived from the transports. Useful work, but perhaps not the best way to employ the skills and authority of the assistant divisional commander. As night fell on day, Hermel decided to send 2 of his officers inland in another attempt to contact Shoup, a mission that took them over 3 hours. When they finally reached Shoup at his command post, they were told to inform Hermley that he urgently needed Hayes' 1st 8th to land at dawn of D+1 on Red Beach 3rd, close to the pier. The 2 finally made their way back to the seaward end of the pier at 3:45 a.m. on D+1, and Hermley commandeered a Higgins boat to take him out to the destroyer Ringgold in the lagoon somewhere off Red Beach 3rd, in order to use her reliable communications for his first message to Julian Smith since leaving the flagship some 11 hours earlier. The message which he eventually sent read, "Shoup desires 1st 8th to land off Red 2nd, with no mention of Shoup's specific instructions that they land close to the east of the pier." Hermley's signal caused consternation on the Maryland. What on earth was he doing aboard the Ringgold? Moreover, Smith had spent all night with Admiral Hill and his staff organizing the landing of 1st 8th on the eastern end of Betio beyond Red Beach 3rd, where they were to secure the area beyond the end of the airfield and work westward to relieve the pressure on Jim Crow. Airstrikes had been arranged to precede the landings, and gunfire support had been laid on. Smith immediately radioed Colonel Hall at 5:22 a.m. to cancel the earlier arrangements, ordering him to prepare to land his 1st Battalion on Red Beach 2nd at 6:15 a.m. Smith, of course, knew nothing of Shoup's request that they land close to the pier on Red 3rd, and consequently, when 1st 8th approached the beaches, the massacre of the previous day would be repeated. The 1st 8th finally left the point of departure around 6:15 a.m., after being embarked for almost 20 hours. The Higgins boats duly ground to a halt on the reef, hundreds of yards short of Red 2nd. The ramps came down, and the Marines duly charged out into chest, deep water and murderous Japanese machine gun and rifle fire. This fire came not only from the beach but also from the wreck of the Niminoa, from which vantage point at least 2 machine guns and many snipers were now picking off the wading Marines more or less at will. 19-year-old Hawk Raider was with the 1st 8th and had been circling around in his landing craft for most of the previous day. Came noon, and we were still circling like a wagon train in the western desert, ready to fend off a bunch of Indians. Then came 2 p.m., and still circling. This went on all night. Guys would stand up to vomit, the wind would catch it and bring it back over the lot of us. Guys would stand at the side of the bobbing boat and try to urinate, and the wind would bring that back over us. Defecate. Forget it, you just had to hold it. By the time 1st 8th got the order to proceed, there were some pretty miserable Marines in our boat. After what seemed an eternity of churning around the lagoon, they were finally instructed to head for Red 2nd. Our boat hit a lump of coral, and the coxswain ordered us out. We were about 700 yards from the beach, and the water at this point was about 5 feet deep. Many times they would be in water well over their heads. Many men drowned because of that. They just could not get out of their gear. Slowly we forged forward. Bullets were coming from dead ahead, from the ship on our right flank, and from the small burns. Philp Pier to the east, about the centre of Red 3rd. Once I got past the end of the main pier, I got away from this line of fire. The ricocheting bullets on the waves churned up by so many boats made the weirdest noises I ever heard in my life. The noise was horrendous. The smoke was choking and smelled of burning flesh and hair. Men were screaming to make themselves heard, and some were trying to help others. I could see many, many bodies floating in the surf. I noticed when a man was hit by a sniper's bullet, or in any manner, he would go down. Then another man or two would go to his aid, and a machine gun would cut them all down. I decided there and then to obey my training. Do not become a casualty. It takes 2 others to take care of you, and then there is 3 out of action. I tried not to align myself with any person in front of me, so as not to tempt a machine gunner. I saw the water kick up around me several times, which I assumed was from a sniper or rifleman, but I was not hit. I tried to make myself a scarcer target by zigzagging, and it worked. I decided that I would make it alone, or die alone. I did not want anyone else getting annihilated because of coming to my aid. Hawk carried on along the west side of the pier and decided to have a rest. Apart from his usual equipment, he was carrying a box of machine gun ammunition and a box of spare parts. A machine gunner, somewhere in the Red 3rd area east of the main pier, was watching the pier. I would say he was somewhere in the area of the Burns, Philp Pier. He saw my head and decided to have a go with a machine gun burst. By the time he had got my head in his sights, I had pulled my head back. He fired a burst with very good aim, hitting the coral and knocking it all over me. So I started towards the beach again. It was at this time I saw a sight that I shall never forget, and it hurt me deeply. About 12 or 15 Marines were dead. What made it stand out so was that half the Marines were American Indians. These Indian boys had been recruited for, and trained in, communications work. They spoke an Indian dialect we knew the Japanese would not understand should they cut in on our wires. Hawk continued down the side of the long pier and finally made it to the seawall on Red Beach 2nd. The Japanese, in their still secure stronghold between Red 1st and Red 2nd, could scarcely have believed that the enemy were repeating the previous day's tactics, and as the hapless Marines hung up on the reef again, and wilted again under a slashing fire from the beach and from the hulk of the Niminoa, Shoup and the troops on shore could only watch in amazement and anger. From first daylight until after 8 a.m. or so on the second day, there was an uneasy lull in the battle, remembers Bob Libby of 3rd 2nd, over on the western point of Red 1st. Then the landings were made, and all hell and bedlam cut loose as reinforcements began to come in over the reef. Why they used the same style of landing as we had was more than I could understand. The majority of Green Beach was free of enemy forces, so why a tentative landing was not attempted from this angle was something beyond belief. Such an attempt may well have saved lives. Under the circumstances, the Japanese would have been hard-pressed to launch a defensive attack. On the other hand, communications from our area to Colonel Shoup were virtually non-existent. Therefore, it was not known what was going on Red 1st. During that Sunday morning, Shoup decided that it was time to do something about the Niminoa. Of the 199 men in Major Hayes' first wave of 1st 8th, only 99 arrived on the beaches unharmed, and many of the casualties had been caused by fire from the hulk. The landings were suspended for a while, and carrier-based aircraft were summoned to make a strike on the rusting steamer. Hellcat fighter bombers made pass after pass over the ship, raking it with their .50 caliber machine guns and dropping 500-pound bombs, but with little effect. Of the dozen bombs dropped, only one hit the ship, one of the misses falling 200 yards away. Furiously unimpressed, David Shoup decided to send a party of Marines out to clear the ship. Approaching from the blind side, the group boarded the Niminoa and heard at least 2 machine guns rattling away on the far side. They climbed to the 3rd deck and could see a large number of Japanese gunners well concealed behind the steel plating on the port side. The sergeant leading the party moved his men out of earshot and radioed his report to Shoup, who decided that the patrol was too small to tackle so many enemy, and ordered them back to shore. Eventually, Shoup asked for naval gunfire on the hulk, reluctantly, because of the risk of hitting the pier or even the beaches, but the Navy provided a short, accurate barrage from the battleships Maryland and Colorado, which finally left the old steamer a smoking, mangled, and silent heap of metal. 10 am. November 20, 1st, 1940. 3. I am still alive. many are not. That day dawned a beautiful South Pacific day after a miserable night of lapping water over our bodies and land crabs crawling over us. We were not allowed to move, and were to challenge anyone who did. Halt! Who goes there? What is the password? Ohio, repeat, Columbus. That was the pre-arranged code. When challenged, give a state name, and when told to repeat, give the capital. Later I was accused of requiring the naming of all 48 states. So recalls artilleryman George Blakeman of 1st 10th, who had spent his night behind the sea wall on Red Beach 2nd. The artillery that had managed to get ashore late on 20th November now began to play a part in the battle. Colonel Rixey had 2 of his pack howitzers moved to the western end of Red 2nd and began pounding the strong point at the eastern end of the cove that had been responsible for so much carnage. Using delay fuses, they blasted the Japanese position for over half an hour, and this would enable Hayes to land the remainder of 1st 8th with fewer casualties. At about 8 a.m., Major Hayes had reported to Shoup with what was then available of his battalion. Most of the equipment that was desperately needed ashore had been lost in the water. Demolition packs, flamethrowers, and heavy weapons were at a premium. The 1st 8th had suffered perhaps 50% dead, wounded, and missing. Many men were still out on the reef, taking cover behind abandoned Amtraks and other wrecks, and would filter in when they thought they saw some let-up in the enemy fire. Later in the day, as the tide rose, heavier equipment such as 37mm anti-tank guns, jeeps, bulldozers, and half-tracks would come ashore, but for the moment David Shoup could only make do with what he had. Shoup was in the best position to have an overall grasp of the situation on Betio. He was in personal contact with both Jim Crow and Walter Jordan, and radio communications had improved sufficiently for repeated, if not continuous, contact with Ryan on Red 1st and with Julian Smith aboard the Maryland. At some point in the morning, one of the Japanese who were still imprisoned inside the bunker beside Shoup's command post managed to dislodge the debris used to block up the vents sufficiently to poke his rifle through, and shot a Marine in the leg. More than a little short of temper, having had little sleep and being increasingly troubled by his leg wounds, Shoup sent a couple of Marines into the bunker with enough grenades to finally silence all its occupants. The medical situation on the island was acute, because of the unexpectedly large numbers of casualties and the confusion in bringing supplies ashore. Medical equipment soon began to run short. The Navy medical corpsmen, who traditionally provide medical services for the United States Marines, and who were identified by white discs painted on their helmets and dungarees, were reduced to making regular foraging expeditions to the beaches to relieve dead bodies of their first aid kits. One doctor, Lieutenant Herman Bruchart, led a team working in a disused pillbox, attending to over 100 wounded men during the first 36 hours and only losing 4. At one stage, a Japanese walked in and was dispatched on the spot by one of the walking wounded. The pillbox was only yards from the constantly moving front line, and machine gun and snipers' bullets rained all around it. There were so many casualties that the Marines who were able to walk were kept outside and only called in when room became available. Lieutenant Bruchart would recall, "When our anesthetics gave out, I had to perform some pretty painful operations, but few of them let out a whimper." Out on the reefs, the rescue operations were also proving extremely hazardous. Navy Lieutenants Edward A.W.T. Heimberger and John Fletcher, salvage officers from the transport Sheridan, found that many wounded Marines were on the reefs and still under fire. "It was my job to pull out boats which had been damaged and could be repaired," says Heimberger. "Since all the boats were beyond salvage, I concentrated on saving lives instead." After picking up a number of Marines from the reef, he realized that more transport was needed, so he commandeered some landing craft from the lagoon and returned to the beleaguered troops offshore. With the tide now on the way in, his boats were coming under fire from both the beaches and the Niminoa. Waving the rest of his flotilla back, Heimberger and his crew raced to the reef, silencing a Japanese sniper who fired on them from an abandoned landing craft on the way in. Finally, I came across a group of Marines huddled in the water and still under fire. They had been stopped in their advance on the beach, and there were dead and wounded all around them. I do not suppose there were 30 unwounded men in the bunch. I did not have room for them all, so I called out, "Come on, 10 of you guys climb aboard and I will take you out of here." Nobody moved. A voice from the group asked, "Did you say you were coming back, Lieutenant?" I nodded. "Well then, bring us back some rifles. We are going in again." Well, I got back to my ship as fast as I could, but by the time I returned, those Marines had disappeared. Some of their cadavers we found next day, all of them closer to the beach and the enemy. On one of his trips, Heimberger came across Colonel Hall of the 8th Marines making his way to the beach, and informed him about the wounded on the reef and of the heavy fire that was coming from the Niminoa. Colonel Hall transferred his regimental surgeon to assist the rescue group, who continued to evacuate wounded Marines from the reef for the remainder of the day. Lieutenant Heimberger is probably better known to older readers by his professional name as a film actor, Eddie Albert. Shoop's principal objectives for D+1 were to push south across the airfield to the other side of the island, effectively cutting the Japanese garrison in two, and to link up with Major Ryan on Red Beach first. Major Hayes' weakened and disorganized 1st 8th Marines were given the task of supporting the troops on the right flank of Red Beach 2nd, who were expected to push across the cove towards Ryan's enclave. As happened so often on Tarawa, this force was a hodgepodge of whoever happened to be available at the time, the survivors of 2nd under Lieutenant Colonel Jordan, a party from the 2nd Marines Headquarters and Service Company, Lieutenant Hawkins' Scout Snipers, part of the absent Major Schotel's Headquarters element, and an assortment of orphaned crewmen from the Amtrak Battalion. Marine training allowed for situations such as this, and one of the great achievements of the battle was the way in which scattered groups of men from different units, riflemen, gunners, drivers, engineers, radio men, all blended smoothly into effective fighting teams to meet the needs of the moment. Although Lieutenant Hawkins' Scout Snipers were still fighting on Red 2nd, the lieutenant himself was not. The 1944 report to describe in the driest terms how, on the western flank of Red Beach 2nd, William D. Dease, Hawkins had that morning become the second of the 3 posthumous Medal of Honor winners of Tarawa. During the night, Lieutenant Hawkins located where the enemy machine guns were firing from and did the planning for their elimination in the morning. D+1 at 6:30, Lieutenant Hawkins led 2 sections 75 yards west along the beach and eliminated 3 pillboxes and returned to the command post. He reorganized the platoon at 8:30 and again proceeded west along the beach to eliminate snipers and more pillboxes that were holding up the advance. During this operation, Lieutenant Hawkins was severely wounded and taken to the regimental aid station. Previous to this, he had been wounded, but continued to lead the platoon. The platoon stayed at the jetty at the boundary of Red Beaches 1st and 2nd, directing tanks until ordered back to the command post at 12. Even with the addition of Hayes' men, the situation on the western flank of Red 2nd was precarious. By noon, the Marines had 1 tank to support their attack, but could make little impression on the enemy defences. Every time that the Marines broke cover, they were met by a murderous hail of machine gun fire that sent them scuttling for the nearest shell hole or tree trunk. Attempts were made to coordinate their charges with the fire from the tank's 75mm gun, but little ground was taken. And without the flamethrowers and demolition charges lost during the landings, a grim stalemate settled in. By now the sun was high in the sky, and the dreadful stench of death hung heavy in the air. The bodies of the Marines gunned down on the reefs and beaches on the previous day were now in a distressing state. Some attempts had been made to gather together the dead for temporary burial, but Japanese guns still covered most of the beaches, and anyone who ventured more than a few yards from the sea wall was taking his life in his hands. Robert Sherrod recalled, 31 Marines are now laid out in a line beyond the command post. Little could be done for those pathetic corpses bobbing in the water like so much abandoned driftwood, or strewn across the beaches, or huddled among the palm trees, until the enemy had been rolled back far enough to allow the corpsmen to retrieve dog tags and personal possessions and give them a temporary burial until it was all over. In the early afternoon, young Hawk Raider of 1st 8th was still pinned down on the beach just west of the Long Pier by relentless Japanese fire. You just had to sit in the water below the level of the sea wall, or you would lose your head. The Japanese had several machine gun pillboxes along this area, which was only about 400 yards long. They had dug down behind these large stones and were firing just over the top of them. The tops of the pillboxes were covered with concrete and had a coconut logging framework filled with sand on top of that. There was a good 2 feet of sand in the log frameworks, which were tied together with huge staples made of half-inch steel rods. It took a direct frontal hit with a large shell to knock them out. These were finally finished off with flamethrowers and satchel charges. It was now about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was sitting with my back to the sea wall. I heard a shell go off behind me. It sounded like a 60mm mortar shell. I heard a piece of shrapnel coming. Whee smack! It struck me in the middle of the back. I took off my dungaree jacket and started to feel for blood. A close buddy of mine saw me and asked what I was doing. I told him I was hit in the back. He looked around at my back and said to me, "You are not hit at all. There is no blood on your back." He said I was just cracking up. He grabbed me and started slapping me across the face. I shoved him away so hard that he went down. While he was getting up, I said to him, "Damn it, Willie, I got hit. I heard it coming. I felt it hit me. I felt it burn. And it hurt." He looked at me so hard and so strange, I thought he was going to club me. I pulled my jacket round and looked at the back, and there it was. It had scorched my jacket and was still sticking to it. It was thin and about the size of a thumbnail. Willie and I had a good laugh about it and got back to business. Move, stop and wait. Move, stop and wait. We were now almost to the west end of Red Beach 2nd, where Red 1st and 2nd come together. There had been a large gun emplacement hit by a bomb or large naval shell. I never did see what kind of a gun it was because there were so many coconut logs and so much sand had fallen down on top of it so that it was completely covered. We were told to set up our machine gun on the logs to cover the beach to our west, Red Beach 1st. This was about 5 p.m. They came back about an hour later and told us we would probably move on, but in another hour we were told we were going to spend the night there. We had not seen any movement since we set up. We were under orders to open fire on anyone coming down that beach. We were told that everyone on that end of the island had been annihilated, that put about as much fear into us as could be put into us. Some men opened up their rations. They would take a bite of them, look at them and throw them away. Some of these men never ate breakfast on day, never ate while we were circling around all day and night in the boats, and now here it was near the end of D+1 and their stomachs still would not accept food. Some of these men had not really had a meal in 72 hours. Their eyes were red and looked as if they had sunk 2 inches back into their skulls. The wind was very light as we were right on the equator, and the smoky smell of fires on the island mixed with salt air and the stench was really terrible. About 30 feet to the back of us, behind the rock sea wall, was a Japanese machine gun nest which had been burned out with a flamethrower. The gunner was still sitting up with his hands as much as was left on the trigger end of the gun. The assistant gunner was also sitting up along with the gunner. It looked as if their muscles froze when the jellied gasoline hit them. 2 or 3 others of the gun squad had fallen over in the back of them as though they were trying to dodge the fire. This was an awful thing to look at, and now it was over 24 hours since it happened. 24 hours for a corpse in the equatorial sun can result in an awful odour, let alone one that has been burned to a crisp. Private Clarence Shanks of C Company, 1st 8th, on Red 2nd, we progressed slowly to our right, which turned out to be the west, firing at rarely seen Japanese, at bunkers, at what appeared to be snipers in palm trees and throwing grenades. Navy dive bombers came in strafing and dropping bombs in areas identified by markers and coming uncomfortably close to us. There were periods of calm in our vicinity which were suddenly broken by machine gun and rifle fire from unseen emplacements. On Red 3rd, Joe Jordan of 2nd 8th was more optimistic. Things had to be better today than yesterday. We were probably 50 to 100 yards in depth from the ocean. That was a lot deeper than day 1. Water, rations and ammo were more plentiful, and we continued to work on 1 pillbox at a time all day. Now we had some artillery on the island, at least 2 tanks were helping, and several half-tracks were running around. I do not mean that it was developing into a walkaway, but it was better. I do remember that we got across the airfield taxiway and recaptured all of the territory that we gave back on the pullback. Casualties were again heavy, but we were getting more speedy help from the corpsmen. No one can ever brag about the Navy medical corpsmen enough. They were the best troops around and could not do enough to help the wounded. They were the bravest men I have ever seen. The Japanese had used the first night to rectify a major flaw in their defenses. During day, some Marines had succeeded in crossing the western taxiway of the airfield and were in positions in the triangle formed by the taxiways and the main runway. The Japanese now had machine guns set up across the ends of the taxiways, and anyone who attempted to cross was facing almost certain death. This meant that the Marines inside the triangle, mainly Companies A and B of Major Wood Kyle's 1st 2nd, were virtually cut off from the troops on Red Beach 2nd. In preparation for Shoup's planned drive southwards across the center of the island, carrier aircraft were called in to blast the enemy positions in the south. The Hellcats and Dauntlesses wheeled in from the northwest and strafed and bombed the 125-yard wide strip between the runway and the sea. But, as with the attack on the Niminoa, the bombing became wild. Bullets and bomb fragments soon began to fall in the Marines' territory, and Shoup was forced to call off the planes. Meanwhile, Major Kyle had rounded up some .30 and .50 caliber machine guns, and a duel was going on between the American and Japanese gunners for control of the taxiways. Shortage of ammunition eventually halted this, and nobody was able to cross over to the triangle before the attack to the south was mounted. The stalemate had to be broken, and at 1 p.m. the Marines from the triangle, around 200 men in all, raced across the main runway of the airfield, on through the undergrowth, round the shell holes and shattered palm trees, and did not let up until they reached the southern shore of the island. Japanese fire was heavy, especially as the men crossed the runway, but to everyone's surprise, the casualties were comparatively light. Once on the south side of the island, the Marines occupied enemy trenches for a length of about 200 yards, where they were soon hit by a Japanese counterattack mounted from the eastern flank. The fighting was fierce, and the Marines suffered heavy casualties before a temporary lull set in. Ammunition had become scarce, but malfunctions among the field radios prevented Shoup, Walter Jordan, and Wood Kyle from keeping abreast of the situation. Colonel Jordan was worried when he heard nothing from this element and expressed his concern to Shoup. Shoup decided to move Jordan and his 2nd command post over to the south side, and at about 4 p.m. this party reached the isolated Marines, and Jordan assumed command. He had brought a communications team with him, and radio contact was again established with Shoup on the northern beach. Shoup was anxious that Jordan should strike to the east and attempt to link up with Jim Crow pushing southeast from Red 3rd, thus possibly sealing off the eastern half of the island. However, Walter Jordan replied that there were less than 200 men left in the position, including 30 wounded, that ammunition, grenades, food and water were in short supply, and that the Japanese were in increasing strength on his eastern flank. Given the circumstances, Shoup told Jordan to consolidate his position and arranged for the necessary supplies to be sent across in Amtraks, which would return with the wounded. At the eastern end of the beachhead on Red 3rd, Jim Crow was having a frustrating time. Try as he might, he was unable to make any progress beyond the Burns-Philp Wharf, where the Japanese had a group of heavily fortified positions which resisted all the Marines' efforts to clear them. Just beyond the wharf was a coral-covered steel pillbox, and slightly further inland was a large bomb-proof shelter. The mutually reinforcing fire from these 2 points had held up Company F all morning. Fierce exchanges of fire continued for most of the day, but however many of the enemy were annihilated, there seemed to be a never-ending supply of reinforcements to take their places. "Where the hell are they coming from?" Crow fumed. "Do they have a tunnel to Tokyo or something?" A lone Sherman tank was available to 2nd 8th and was doing sterling service. It silenced one particularly troublesome machine gun post about 100 yards west of the bomb-proof shelter by blasting the gun port at close range. When the enemy gun fell silent, a bulldozer pushed forward and buried the whole position in sand and coral. However, the tank was too valuable and vulnerable to be risked beyond the American front line. Both Company F and Company K to their right were pinned down whenever they tried to move east, and a bitter stalemate set in along the entire front. Crow decided that the best that could be achieved at present was to consolidate his lines and dig in until reinforcements were available, probably not until D+2. He placed a 37mm gun on the beach to provide protection against enemy tanks, and at dusk a patrol was sent forward to stop the Japanese from reoccupying the Burns-Philp Wharf. During fierce exchanges during the night of November 21st, 22nd, the Marines annihilated 15 Japanese for the loss of 2 of their own men. The whole of the eastern end of Betio was still covered by a huge pall of smoke and dust. This was the only part of the island where naval, air, and artillery fire could be safely directed, and the flyers and gunners were making the most of it. Meanwhile, over on Green Beach, the most significant gains of the second day, and perhaps of the whole battle, were being made by Major Mike Ryan and his assortment of Marines. Ryan still had the Sherman tank China Gal, minus her 75mm gun, but still valuable as a mobile machine gun nest, and another, Cecilia, which had bogged down on day, had now been recovered and would soon be in fighting order. During the night of day, a naval gunfire spotter, Lieutenant Thomas Green, had come ashore and was now available to Ryan. The main defences on Green Beach lay in the southwest corner around Temkin Point, and although the British 8-inch Vickers guns had been knocked out during the preliminary bombardment on day, the Japanese still had 2 medium guns in steel turrets, 5 other assorted artillery pieces, and a formidable array of machine gun emplacements, rifle pits, trenches, and tank traps. When we were ready to start our attack, recalls Ryan, I sent my runner to find the officer with the radio from the adjacent battalion and tell him that if regiment could be contacted, he should tell them that we were going to attack along Green Beach. After a while, the runner came back to say that they said to hold on so they could call an airstrike. I sent the runner back twice, requesting that the airstrike be called off since we were ready to go. He came back finally and said it was cancelled. Lieutenant Green called in 2 destroyers, later supplemented by other ships, and a bombardment started at around 10 a.m. The Japanese emplacements were pounded from close range for nearly an hour, the shells at times falling close to the Marines' front line. The ground jumped and kicked beneath them where they lay, and some men suffered burst eardrums. The attack that morning was well coordinated, says Mike Ryan. Lieutenant Green controlled the naval gunfire preparation. It was quite heavy, including 5-inch to 8-inch guns. 8-inch fire was brought to within less than 50 yards of our front lines. In fact, the fire requested was so close to where we reported our front line to be that the naval ships would not respond to the request unless the divisional commander himself approved. General Smith told me this years later. Other Marines later told me that they still remembered the explosions shaking the ground in their holes. When the naval gunfire stopped, the Marines swept forward. The Sherman Cecilia cleared the way for the advancing riflemen, blasting pillboxes and gun emplacements, and leaving the mopping up for the troops coming up behind. By not long after 11 a.m., the whole of Green Beach had been overrun. The Marines could stand by the 8-inch Vickers guns and gaze south to the open sea, and east along the length of the main runway of the airfield and the south shore. With the help of the bombardment and the tanks, the troops soon overran enemy positions to the extent that control of Green Beach was established, says Ryan. I sent this information by runner to the radio on the beach. Large horned mines were discovered on the reef on the right half of Green Beach, and this information was sent verbally to the radio on the beach. In one short and brilliantly coordinated attack, Ryan had succeeded in clearing the whole of the western shore of Betio, thus providing an undefended beach for the 6th Marines to make their much-delayed landing. It is little wonder that Julian Smith would call it the most cheering news of D+1. Not content with the morning's success, Ryan sent a message that he was now gathering his force for an attack along Red Beach first, in an attempt to join up with Colonel Shoup. Later I sent a message back verbally to the effect that we would now organize an attack along Red Beach to recontact regiment. When my runner returned, he said, "They said, stay where you are." With that, I felt that we were back under control of regiment. They knew we were ready and able to organize an attack along Red Beach. I expected to be ordered to do this, and waited for it. Bob Libby, from Ryan's makeshift command, recalls the events of that day on the western end of Betio. With daylight at around 5 a.m., we were soon up and about. There was no sign of any Japanese activity in our immediate vicinity, so we took the opportunity to dig into our packs and find something to eat. This was our first taste of food since coming ashore. It was while we were sitting there on a coconut log that several cameramen who had spent the night on the beach came and joined us. We shared our meagre rations with them and chatted a while. It appeared that they had intended to come inland after dark, but were not sure who was in control of this sector, so they had stayed put until daylight. A few minutes later, 2 Marines appeared with a walking wounded Japanese officer, Part. He had been stripped of clothing except for the loincloth that he was wearing. A rough and dirty bandage hung from his right leg. Hands in the air, he sullenly passed by to be treated at the makeshift hospital further down the beach. One of the cameramen took a shot of him, hoping that his equipment and film were in working order. The picture came out fine, and is one of the well-known pictures of the battle. Soon after this, we were gathered together and given the task of sweeping to the south to cover the coastline on the seaward side of the island. Before we set off on this mission, we could see that reinforcement troops were having a rough time landing from the lagoon. We got the distinct impression that the Japanese were not particularly concerned with the Americans who had already landed on Betio, but were hell-bent on stopping any more coming ashore. Perhaps they thought that if they could stop any further landings, they could deal with us at their leisure. We made extremely good time in crossing the island. We came across a few pockets of resistance, but swiftly overcame them. Bending our flank, we headed towards the center of the island, but were halted when we reached the boundary of our area, something I never quite understood. Maybe it was thought that any further advance would have brought us into the crossfire between the Japanese and our own fire, but had we been able to continue, we would have ended up behind the enemy defenses and created major problems for them. We were brought to a halt and used as a solid flank for the Marines on Red 2nd in their attempt to flush out the defending Japanese. With us in force on the flank, the Japanese had nowhere to go but into the sea at their rear. There were still Japanese in some of the larger bunkers, which were more than our force could handle as we had no suitable equipment for the task. The mixed-up bunch of Marines from all sorts of units banded together and made a concerted attempt to broaden our skimpy beachhead. Over the following hour or two, we made our area virtually free of organized enemy forces. Yes, there were still confined groups of Japanese, but we were at least able to move about quite openly without fear of surprise attacks. The heaviest fighting seemed to be taking place on our left flank. We could hear the sounds of deep explosions as pillboxes and bunkers were being dynamited with TNT and Bangalore torpedoes. When it seemed that Ryan's motley command had secured their area, Libby and his comrades did some exploring around the southwest of the island. Standing on the southern beach, we could look out over hundreds of yards of waterless reef. The Japanese had expected us to make our attack from this direction, and we saw long stretches of barbed wire entanglements and many obstacles that appeared to be made of concrete or rock. Looking over to our left, we saw a column of 9 prisoners being herded along by several riflemen. Someone told us later that they were Koreans, not Japanese, and to our right was the remains of a large gun emplacement. There were 2 emplacements each containing dual guns which looked like 90mm to me, both pointed out to sea. Presumably these were the Type 89 twin 127mm guns, some hundreds of yards east of Temkin Point on the south shore. We made a search of the area, and in doing so flushed out a very agitated-looking Japanese who, in his panic, ran towards us rather than away to his own lines. It made little difference, really, for he was doomed from the minute he saw us. Our officer yelled for him to be taken alive, but he was too slow, as about 5 grenades followed him into the hole that he jumped into. Returning to the guns, we started fooling around, raising and lowering the barrels and pressing various buttons, and finally set off some kind of buzzer. Not knowing what we had done, we all made an undignified scramble for the nearest cover, but as nothing happened, we eventually returned for another look. The emplacements were quite large and circular in shape, with built-in revetments in the concrete walls. Looking inside one of them, I came across a very dead Japanese. There was not a mark on him, and it was obvious that he had not been dead for very long. He was smartly dressed in his combat green uniform, wraparound leggings and slot-toe shoes. To all purposes, he looked as if he were sleeping. In his left hand was a live grenade, and alongside him was one of the old-style bayonets, the type with the hook, which I knew were becoming pretty rare, so I decided to retrieve it. After carefully checking for booby traps, I was able to slide my bayonet under his and lift it up without incident. I still have it in my collection. At the rear of the emplacement, a hatchway led into a sort of control room, a semi-blockhouse with slots dotted along the sides. Knowing the enemy's liking for hideaways, we lobbed a hand grenade through one of the holes, and our suspicions proved to be correct as we were answered by a burst of machine gun fire. Luckily, no one was hurt. There was no way that we were going to tackle a blockhouse on our own, and someone went off in search of assistance. After what seemed to be an age, he returned with 2 engineers complete with Bangalore torpedoes. They linked them up with detonators and stuffed them through one of the slots. A heavy muffled explosion followed, then silence. Moving to the other side of the bunker, we found a flight of stairs with a door at the bottom. We tried to open it, but it was either locked or barricaded from the inside. We gathered together what grenades we had left between us and worked our way round, lobbing them into every slot and hole that we could find. We heard a number of shots from inside, and then silence. Nothing more was heard, and we assumed that the Japanese who had survived had shot themselves, but we never found out for sure as we were relieved shortly afterwards and withdrew to our original position, only to find that a group of officers had moved into our little refuge, so we ended up the day trying to dig foxholes on the beach, a bit like spooning sugar out of a bowl. By nightfall we were comparatively safe in our little area, although we were not aware of this fact until later. We had created a broad front safe enough for the 6th Marines to land safely on Green Beach behind us, and they passed through our holding line and became committed to action further along the island. In Bob Libby's opinion, Major Ryan was not at all the glory-hunting type of officer so often depicted in wartime epics. He thought him a quiet, unassuming man who would work without panic and get results without a lot of fanfares. Libby thought it possible that Ryan's deceptively low-key manner may have stood in the way of the full recognition that he deserved. Situation at 4 p.m. Our line runs generally from the Burns-Philp Wharf across the east end of the triangle formed by the airfield to the south coast, and along the coast intermittently to a place opposite the west end of the triangle. Then from the revetments north of the west end of the main airstrip onto the north, another line from most of the centre of Red First across the end of the island to the south coast west of the end of the main strip. Some troops in 227, gunnery target area designation for eastern half of Red First, dishing out hell and catching hell. Pack howitzers in position and registered for shooting on tail of Betio. Casualties many, percentage dead not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. Shoop. So ran the message sent by the commander of the 2nd Marines combat team to division on the late afternoon of D+1. General Julian Smith copied the message on to Howling Mad Smith, somewhere off the shore of Macon. On receiving it, the 5th Corps commander is said to have smiled at Admiral Kelly Turner for the first time in weeks. Although the situation in the centre of the island was more or less static, Ryan's successful advance down Green Beach allowed the 6th Marines a virtually undefended area in which to make their landing, in sharp contrast to the carnage that had taken place on the Red Beaches. In fact, the area was so secure that Major Jones's 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, were given the unusual task of landing in rubber boats. Landing crafts rubber had been used in river crossings in the past, but never for an amphibious landing, and, given the massive scale of future operations on Saipan, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, would never be used for this purpose again. The transport ship Phelan closed to Green Beach at around 2 p.m. on the 21st, and the disembarkation got underway. However, for some obscure reason the transport was ordered out to sea again, and the rubber boats had to be re-embarked with a great deal of confusion and delay. The Phelan was finally given clearance to return to the beach and positioned herself 1,200 yards offshore, where the whole business of disembarkation started again. Paddling the rubber craft in the choppy ocean proved to be very hard work, and in many cases they were linked up to Higgins boats in groups of 6 and towed in to shore. The southern part of Green Beach had been heavily mined by the Japanese. One landing vehicle, tracked, struck one of these mines and exploded in a spectacular fireball, only one of the crew surviving. Because of the delays, the landing of 1st 6th was not completed until 7 p.m. Still more chaos attended the landing of B Company. 2nd Tank Battalion, it was discovered that the M3A1 light tanks had been loaded onto the transport in the wrong sequence and were somewhere in the bowels of the ship. Huge amounts of equipment had to be moved to get at them, and when they were finally hoisted onto the landing craft and ferried to the beach, it was nearly dark. Great difficulty was encountered in avoiding the numerous shell holes, mines and reef ledges. 5 tanks were flooded or bogged down. Only 1 platoon was successful in getting onto the beach, the remainder being diverted to Red Beach 2nd, where they came ashore in total darkness. It had been hoped that an evening attack could be made from Green Beach, but because of the delays in landing the reinforcements and the failing light, Colonel Shoop ordered 1st 6th to consolidate their position and wait until dawn. Sometime during the afternoon, an observer on one of the warships in the lagoon reported seeing Japanese troops moving from Betio to Bairiki, the next island in the chain. At low tide it was possible to wade or swim across the coral spit which connected the islands of the atoll. This confirmed Julian Smith's earlier fears and vindicated his request for artillery on Bairiki during the initial landings. Raymond Murray's 2nd 6th Marines, who were to have supported Major Jones' first 6th on Green Beach, were now diverted to Bairiki to block these escape attempts, much to their disgust, as they were looking forward to taking part in the main sweep across Betio, instead of being sidetracked into what they saw as a minor mopping-up operation. As the second day of the battle drew to a close, the balance seemed to be tipping progressively in favor of the landing force. Having spent the previous night clinging precariously to the strip of beach along the sea wall and steeling themselves for what they expected would be an imminent banzai attack, the Marines now held a limited but apparently firm foothold on the south shore, a substantial northern beachhead stretching from halfway across Red Beach 2nd to the Burns, Philp Wharf, and inland almost to the main airfield runway, and the whole western end of the island to a depth of some 200 yards inland from Green Beach. The supply situation was also beginning to improve, although the large and rather indiscriminate dumps on and near the Long Pier contributed little to the rifle company's most desperate needs, water and ammunition. Working parties were sent to the pier to organize priority handling and movement of supplies. During the daylight hours of D+1, Lieutenant Colonel Rixey had been able to get all of his artillery ashore, using any means that he could lay hands on Amtraks, landing craft, rubber boats and rafts. The gun crews from 1st 10th Man handled the short-barreled howitzers onto the beach and set them up to cover the enemy positions at the junction of Red 1st and 2nd and beyond the Burns Philp Wharf. Murray's 2nd 6th had now landed on Bairiki and secured the island without difficulty, and the artillery of 2nd 10th, under the command of the aptly named Colonel Shell, were boated over there to provide support for the final onslaught. On Betio, Lieutenant Colonel Rixey said, "I thought up until 1 o'clock today that it was touch and go. Then I knew we would win." At around 5:50 p.m. on November 20, first, the Chief of Staff of the 2nd Marine Division, Colonel Merritt Edson, left the Maryland at Julian Smith's request to take over command on Betio from the nearly exhausted David Shoup. He arrived at about 8:30 p.m. after a tortuous journey via the Long Pier and spent some time discussing the situation with Shoup and making plans for D+2 before officially taking command, leaving Shoup to get a little rest and concentrate on his own combat team. Colonel David Shoup had borne the main responsibility for the conduct of the land battle for 2 days and a night, mostly cut off from communication with his divisional commander and other command elements by persistent radio problems. He had coordinated the movements of all the landing teams, most of whom were scattered and severely weakened in numbers and equipment from the moment of landing, and mixed haphazardly with other units. Despite these difficulties, and despite his own untreated and now infected leg wounds, he had succeeded in establishing a sound beachhead around Red 2nd and 3rd, in the face of bitter enemy opposition from very well prepared positions. For his leadership he was to be awarded the Medal of Honor, the only one of the 4 Tarawa Marines awarded their country's highest decoration who survived to wear it. For the present he was content to have his wounds dressed, and to find a patch of sand where he could stretch out for a while without someone stepping on him. We may take it that Admiral Shibasaki's boast that 1 million Americans would be unable to take Tarawa was mere rhetoric, but he had believed that reinforcements would be sent once the enemy landed in the Gilberts, had not Admiral Koga said that a hornet's nest for the Yankee had been prepared. Unfortunately for Shibasaki and his naval infantrymen, events elsewhere in the Pacific had robbed Koga's words of meaning. The landings by the 3rd Marine Division on Bougainville in the Solomons on 1st November had prevented Japanese troop reinforcements being sent to the Gilberts, and the massive American airstrikes on the Japanese base and naval task force at Rabaul between 5th and 19th November had destroyed scores of aircraft and disabled many warships. Shibasaki and Tarawa had been abandoned, and over his still operative radio link to Tokyo, he, or whoever was now exercising command in his stead, sent a last message. "Our weapons have been destroyed. From now on, everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 10,000 years." Sometime around 2 a.m. on the morning of 22nd November, D+2, a Japanese aircraft arrived over Betio and dropped a stick of bombs in the water about 50 yards from where Hawk Raiders group from 1st 8th were set up. As the plane banked away, the rear gunner strafed the area for good measure. 2 men were lost to that attack, recalls Raider. A guy named Motterhead from New Jersey, on his first invasion, was hit in the lower abdomen with a machine gun bullet and had to be evacuated. As far as I know, he lived. Jesse Birdsong from Texas, a Guadalcanal veteran, was on watch at the time. I thought he was wounded and tried to pick him up to carry him out. I talked to him before I took hold of him, but he did not answer, and I realized he was hurt very badly. As I picked him up, he just grunted and took his last breath in my arms. My hand had slipped up into a large hole just above his right kidney. The chunk of shrapnel that hit him must have been the size of a fist. I gently laid him down on the logs and knelt down beside him, and I was crying. Someone put their arm around my shoulder and said, "Come on, Jesse is gone."